In 2016, when you started the company, what was the opening that you saw in the market?
So I had been a data analyst for 15 years. Had different job titles, but fundamentally, I had been a data analyst for all my different roles. And there was a bunch of new technology that had come out recently. Amazon had released a data warehouse called Redshift. There was a bunch of new technologies built on Redshift, a BI tool called Looker, a product called Fivetran, and I realized that this new set of technologies enabled uh, data people at small companies, at Series A, B, C startups, to work with data in ways that they had never worked with it before. And so the initial story was not a product story. While DBT enters the picture at some point in time, but the real opening in the market that I saw was nobody at these small companies knew how to work with data this way. And because I came from the inside, I was at one of these companies. I saw this stuff come together. I said, I bet that there's actually space for a new professional services company to go out and do this type of work.
And then did you launch it as a services company?
Yeah, so I launched a company called Fishtown Analytics. In our first day of opening up shop was July 1st of 2016, and my goal. So I remember the conversation with my wife very clearly. I had never really. I'm not like an entrepreneur by heart. I had never had like these big ambitions to go start a world changing company. I just wanted to do some work that I loved, and I was looking around in the Philadelphia tech ecosystem to see if anyone would hire me as a VP of analytics, but there was actually not any like Philly startup right then that was at the right stage in their growth trajectory to like be looking for that role. And I was like, okay, well, what I should do here is just hang out a shingle, and instead of being a VP of analytics for one company, just do it part time for four companies. So that was like that was goal number one.
And how did it then evolve into a product company?
So it was very clear to me that there was of all this new tooling that I was talking about before, there was a tool that did not yet exist in this now what we call the modern data stack. And to not get into like the super details of what are these different products do because they're like reasonably technical, but it the historical category is called data transformation. And it was clear to me from like experiences that I'd had way earlier in my career, using enterprise products like or in the Oracle suite, that like people needed this stuff, and it didn't exist yet. So uh, I, uh, I worked on building an open source tool. My co-founder Drew actually wrote the first lines of code, but we needed this actually to do our consulting work. It was not that we had some like grand ambitions for what this product could become. It was just that we needed it to deliver our service. And it is through exposure to our consulting clients that the initial community around DBT formed. So we would, get into a new consulting client. Their data analysts would get exposed to DBT. They would say, "This is cool," and then they would eventually tell their peers. And so DBT has always been a community first motion, and that is really how the transition from a professional services company to a software company happened. It was the community got big enough and they told us like, "Hey, we need more support from you."
And so tell me more about that. So at first the community was just the people you were interacting
Yep.
with, like kind of like informal community. How did it like get become into a more like a formal community?
Gosh, formal and informal, it's hard lines to draw, but I will
Yeah,
say
let's
that,
say organized, more organized maybe.
yeah. So the initial DBT community formed in New York. And it came out of one particular consulting project that we did. It was with Casper, and this was back when Casper was like this rocket ship company. It was they had maybe a dozen data analysts or something like that, and so we did this project. These dozen data analysts got exposed to DBT, and they were very plugged into the overall New York tech ecosystem. And so, very quickly, other New York tech companies had heard about DBT, and then Casper hosted a DBT meetup at its office, and all the while, we had this Slack channel that had existed since the very beginning. And as people hear about DBT, people say like, yeah, you should join the Slack community. And so people show up and we all help each other out, and not just like in using DBT, but in figuring out how to do analytics in this new way that many of us were trying to figure out at the time. And so it's a combination of this like in-person interactions where the word of mouth spreads, and then all of it comes back to this Slack channel for these ongoing relationships.
What was the moment where you completely dropped the services aspect and said, "Hey, we're now a product company, and this is working, and we should bet our future on this"?
So I will say that we have never totally dropped the professional services part of what we do, and it is specifically because I think that the real insights, you can do as much product management as you want, but on some level, the experience of using the product yourself is the very best way to have product insights. So our professional services team still does the kind of work that we did at the very beginning of the business. In addition, they do a bunch of other stuff. But and they're like highly strategic for us. The time where our the core focus of our business shifted to being a product company is late 2019, and it was specifically because, so at that point in time, the DBT community was about 1,000 companies, and over the course of that year, we had started to get inbound interest from Fortune 500 businesses. The community had gotten big enough that big companies had now started hearing about DBT, and they liked what they saw, and they actually showed up and said like, "Hey, I want to buy something from you because I can't really use this thing if I'm not paying anybody for support or anything like that. Um, but like you don't have anything to sell us." And so we, for the first time, took it seriously that we had always imagined that we were going to be a very base camp business. We were, bootstrapped. We had a very nascent commercial product, but it was all like credit card swipes online, and we had never imagined that there was going to be a sales assisted motion where it's like very focused on large enterprises. And so that all changed over the course of 2019 as we saw this demand come, and we realized that that's just not something that we could service with revenue from our consulting business. Like we had to hire a real sales team, grow the engineering organization. So late 2019 is when we raised our seed round, and then have raised a bunch of rounds of funding since then.
One more question about the professional services. So today, what percentage of revenue is coming from those professional services, or are you just taking them on as a retention play?
That's a good question. Uh, I think we're probably in the like 20% range, and it pretty steadily drops as a percentage of revenue over time.
Hmm.
But the like most strategic part of that, the services revenue stream for us, and I think that this is like incredibly important for anybody who operates in an enterprise business, is that your professional services organization is often one of the most strategic levers you have at making sure that your customers are successful. Um, especially with DBT, there's, it's a very blank canvas. You show up and you can just start writing code kind of however you want, and it is often via interactions with our professional services team where our customers realize, like, oh gosh, there's a much better way to do this. Like, let me migrate to this, new coding style, or whatever it is. So not to be underestimated.
So is the professional services team offering like a done for you thing, or more like
No,
a coaching?
we do quote unquote audits. Um, we do onboarding. We do like very uh, customized training programs. So there's a lot of like acceleration that goes in there.
So when you decided to become more product focused company in 2019,
Yeah.
when you raised the seed round, did you target enterprise level companies, or what was your ICP like?
Yeah. So uh, ICP is challenging for us because DBT is such a horizontal tool. It's like saying, what's the ideal customer profile for Microsoft Excel? It's like,
Mm.
well, I don't know, humans that want to know things. Um, the we certainly uh, the sales assisted motion that we have, we maintain two different motions, really three. We have an open source motion. You download the open source piece of software, you install it locally, and you go off and use it by yourself with support from the community. There's a credit card self service motion. You do all of the stuff that I just said, plus you like use our cloud service and you swipe a credit card to pay for it. And then there's a sales assisted motion where typically that's going to be companies that are much larger. Now we still don't we do very little account development on our own because we're such a, community focused um, company. Really, I don't know, 80+% of our managed revenue comes in from our community, where people just like wave their hands and say, like, hey, help me buy this thing.
So today your Slack group is something like 25,000 people, right?
Correct.
And 80% of the sales leads come from that community.
Correct. And I want to make sure to there's not such a direct line at there. It's not like we're using Slack as a like a demand gen channel. It's just that our community is where our organic growth comes from. There's this, like, if you look at our um, product usage for DBT Core, our open source product, you will see that there's this incredibly consistent growth going back five and a half years now. It's 10% month over month, every single month. And that is the heat that powers that organic growth is all generated in the community. But then those people go off and tell others, and so that the flywheel is all centered around the community. Now, people just show up on they sign up for our product, they hit contact sales, and that is what I talk about when I say like community generated leads.
hmm So community clearly is a very important part of the business, and so I would also then guess that you approach it quite strategically today.
I think that's fair, although I don't want to overstate. Uh, uh, you know, when you run marketing programs, it feels like you have at least some level of control over them. When you A/B test, you start to feel like, I've got real agency here. When it comes to community, the conversations that we have are they feel to me, as a very quantitative person, to be like very squishy. We talk
Mm.
about vibes a lot, because a community really is just a collection of humans, and a lot of what we do there is simply focused on making sure that people have a great experience with the product, and that they form this like cohesive social ties with each other, and those are like really what we're trying to do.
Right. Do you have dedicated community managers, people who are
Yes,
there and in conversations?
we have. I can't remember what it's at right now. We're adding people very quickly, but I think we're at 7 or 8 or 9 humans on the community team right now.
hmm There are a lot of companies in this space it's really heating up. Some of these are doing real well, and some have not done so well. So, what do you think? In addition to the community, what have you done, you as a company, to succeed where some other companies did not?
Our our stance relative to competition is maybe a slightly unusual one. Um, we you referenced that there's certainly a lot of companies in our space. So if you look at our space as being, data today, there's a tremendous number of companies. But if you look at um, the view from a practitioner, there's really a very small number of companies that do specifically what we do, which is data transformation in the modern data stack. And really, the size of our community, our user base, relative to essentially all alternatives put together, there's far more people using DBT in this space than all the other alternatives put together. And so, like, why is that? That's like not typical for a fast moving space. Um, and I think it is because of the fact that we got there early on. Um, we we also were open source since the very beginning, and open source is very challenging to compete with because it's free, and because there's this dynamic of the community ends up not only being a source of growth, but a source of product improvement. Every time we release a new version of DBT, there are a dozen plus members of the community who literally contributed code to that release. So it just this flywheel continues to accelerate, and as the product gets better, as the community gets bigger, there's this ever increasing moat. And you can see this in other leading open source solutions. It tends to be once an open source tool wins a category, it just continues to be very dominant there, which is nice for the ecosystem because it allows subsequent innovators in the space to build on top of that stable foundation.
Yeah. So, would you say that open source and free serves as kind of a moat? Stuff that other companies charge money for, you deliver free.
Yeah, it's a such a different business model. So if your business model is I write code and then I charge people for that code, that is like the model that typically SaaS companies take. Our model is our core IP is yours. You just have it. You can use it. You can literally use it to compete directly with us. Um, what we are selling you is a set of cloud services that makes it easier to use, easier to productionize. And I think that is a model that is becoming increasingly common in software that is sold to software engineers. But we're maybe just a little bit unusual in that we are taking this open source model and broadening it. We're selling it to data people as well.
On your website, you maybe not lead with, but it's the quite central message there is that you're pioneering the practice of analytics engineering. Is that like your narrative to go to market with? Is that something external that happened and you jumped on, or how? Tell me about that analytics engineering.
Yeah. So there I think that one of the things that needs to be true for a community driven company is that you have to actually advance the conversation in your field in some way. And, I was a marketer in the early 2010s, and I really thought about how HubSpot created this category of inbound marketing. And I know that they've tried to kind of move away from this as a strategy, but they were so closely identified with this new way of doing marketing. And it in our case, I think maybe in their case it was like a little more strategic, but in our case, it was very much that We were a professional services company first. We were specifically focused on finding the new way to use this set of technologies that had arisen in the market. And we didn't know what to call that. But we had this, at the time, small community of humans that were all kind of like figuring it out together. And I honestly don't remember who started using that term. I know that it was in the DBT community that the term analytics engineering first started getting used. It wasn't us that wrote the original blog post. There's a community member named Mike Kaminsky that wrote. I can't remember what it was like. What is an analytics engineer or something like that? And that moment was when people really started coalescing around this term, and it has become a really important flag to plant in the ground because we are actually this community is actually doing our jobs differently than people have done their jobs in the past. And so it's important to have something to call that. And you now see it showing up on job descriptions, on LinkedIn profiles, all over the place. So I'll take credit for at least being a part of the stew that created this new way of working and talking about that. But I don't want to claim all the credit.
So you raised your very first round in 2019, and since then, multiple rounds, which means that your fundamental growth motion is in place and is solid. How did you land on it? Is that all community related? What else is going on there?
It's all community related, with maybe a little bit of a layer of we were just talking about inbound marketing. I guess content has been really central for us. It's one of the nice things about being a practitioner is that it's very easy to observe your market, observe best practices, and help surface them to this group of humans. So our blog has always been a real source of almost like, I don't know that it's demand generation in the way that a lot of companies try to target, keywords in their URLs and that kind of stuff. It's more just like it has helped us continue to build that brand with this group of people, and then really most of the traffic that comes to our site and goes through the sign up flow is branded traffic.
So blog is big, but you also do meetups and conferences.
We started conferences in 2020. We were supposed to do that in person, and we transitioned that to an online conference. The meetups have been a part of our story for a long time. We haven't done a perfect job of scaling them, but they really are an ingredient in our community motion. If you think about community as like an NPS thing, what you really want is you don't like the people who are 7s and 8s on the 0 through 10 NPS survey scale. They're great. They're using your thing, and they're going to continue using your thing. But we rely on our community as being our source of growth, and so you really need people at like 9 and 10 who are out there like gushing about your product. And oftentimes, it is these meetups, these like in-person experiences where people have these moments where they're just they get converted from like, yeah, I like your thing, to holy crap, this has changed my life. And so that is really what we're focused on in those events. It's not like how can we get a bunch of new people to come together. It's how do we take our core community members and activate them and make them like really have transformational moments.
In 2021, you guys wrote on your blog that you 6x your revenue and 3x your customer count. What do you attribute this to?
Just the pace of growth.
The pace of growth, yeah, it's insane number.
I would say that 2021 was a very unusual year, not just for us, but like it's not that typical to see a software company go 6x in a year. I think that there's a tremendous amount of latent demand in our open source ecosystem. So if you go and talk to VCs about how do they value businesses. If you're talking about a straight up SaaS business, they value that in a certain way, and there is now an emerging viewpoint in the VC ecosystem for how do you value an open source company, because open source companies tend to they don't actually show revenue for much further into their trajectory, because first you have to build the open source product, which by its very nature is free. So you go through that period for, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 years, and only then do you then start to commercialize. But once you've commercialized, there's this deep group of humans who is like ready and banging on your door to like buy something from you. And so you can observe the same trend in, many of the great open source companies that have IPO'd over the past several years. Um, but yeah, I think it's really just that our revenue numbers looked like a SaaS company that has been active for 2 years, but really we're an open source company that's been active for almost 6 years now.
Another thing you said on your blog is that you recognize that the space you're in is heating up, and the reason for you to the reason for your most recent raise was that you need to build differentiated products.
Yep.
So tell me about that type of thinking.
So it is, we were talking about competition before, and one of the things that is unique and challenging in an open source context is that you have to create two products. You have to create the open source product, but then you also have to create the commercial product. And the challenge with creating the commercial product is that everyone else in the ecosystem can also build on top of your open source product. So there is this deep history of especially the hyperscale cloud providers taking successful infrastructure projects and just rolling out versions of them that are integrated into the cloud product. And maybe they aren't the best way to do whatever it is, but simply by virtue of being distributed by one of the hyperscalers, it is a very compelling option to many folks. And so that was, our community had reached a level of visibility where we were very realistic about the idea that these companies might use a similar playbook that they had used many times in the past. And so now it wasn't good enough that we were the DBT company. We also had to have the best, not just the only, but the best commercial version of DBT. It's not unique to us. It's something that like every open source company out there is mindful of and worried about this exact threat.
What happens in a lot of spaces is that over time competitors become increasingly similar to each other. So to the point where there's like really no difference between this or that, and so hence they're planning to compete on brand or some sort of affiliation.
Sure.
How are you guys thinking about that?
I think that I know that I've done a lot of talking here about like the different dynamics that are at play in an open source ecosystem, but really there is we don't have our biggest competition is our own open source product. And so the thing that you're talking about is not a thing that is in my brain as something to focus on. If a company wants to do this type of work, they're going to use DBT to do it. And so over time, the thing that I am focused on is how do we make sure to see like the next set of challenges that our ecosystem as a whole is going to have, and like push the product forwards in those directions.
And so what are you betting your future on? So like if you think 10 years into the future, what kind of strategic bets are you making?
Yeah, gosh, this is like the fun part. The the data ecosystem is not done changing. It went through big changes in the 2010s. It's going to go through big changes in the 2020s as well. The part that I am focused on right now is that there's all of these innovations that we have brought to the practice of working in data over the past 5 years, and they're things that we have stolen from software engineering. So writing high quality modular code, running your code through automated testing, deploying in an automated fashion. Like there's all these like quality things that software engineers have really figured out. But so we've brought them to data pipelines. But the next thing is that you've got this whole new set of users that they're involved in the insights generation process. So the people actually answering business questions with data, and the assets that they create, dashboards and reports, are largely not produced in these kind of quality driven workloads. They, reports break all the time. They disagree with each other. So we're moving into this space, not by building a tool that competes with the very like widely known set of, BI tools out there, but by building a layer of technology infrastructure where all of these BI tools can plug in to it, and we can empower them with a single source of truth, a workflow that they can use to test and version control their analytic code. So that is, I think, really the story of the next 5 years. You ask me 10 years, I don't know the answer to that. You have to come back to me in 5 more.
My last question. So the journey that you've been on now since 2016 to today, 6 years, I guess. What are some key lessons that you would pass on to other B2B founders? Business lessons.
Thanks for specifying. I think that one of the things I'm like I have an MBA. I really enjoy the like academic discipline of strategy. I think that a lot of the strategic insights that I've gotten over the past years are ones that like literally no one has ever taught me, and they're very counterintuitive. I think that the biggest one is that it is actually possible to create trust at scale, and that if you start from a place of trust, then there are completely different ways that people can relate to one another. So I've talked about this publicly before, but the most recent ENPS survey that we've done, engagement for our employees internally, is the result was 90. So like 50 is phenomenal, but 90 is like as close to as high as you can actually get on the scale. And I was talking to new hires about this recently, and I was trying to reflect on like how is it that we were able to do this? And but the funny thing is, all of our internal, the ways that we work together, our cross-functional collaboration, the way that we do async decision making, are like so much of the way that we work together requires this high trust environment. And if you then like turn it around and you look at our relationships with the community, they're all based on trust. Like our values as a company are at the center of everything we do, and we relate to our own community. And so I guess to me, that is this big unexplored area of business strategy. Like, how can you actually work differently as a company if you you turn up different organizational dynamics than have traditionally been able to do before? We're in this era where COVID has created a lot of opportunity to just decide that we're gonna work differently together, and I think that it's this big reset moment. And so I think leaders have an opportunity to make some very proactive decisions that deviate from the ways of working in the past.